the food chain in Britain starts possibly in Brazil, maybe in the United States, with the production of maize and the production of soya. If it's soya, that will be pressed, the oil removed in Brazil or in the United States. The soya meal is shipped into Europe, probably going through one of the big ports, maybe going into Holland, brought into a feed mill, produced into concentrated feed that then goes into a poultry unit. Those birds have a life of only 45 days. They're fed, they're slaughtered, and then they're processed, and they're put into a plastic package where you buy it and then go and cook it, or it's being processed further into some kind of ready-made meal and then into the home. It removes us from the responsibilities of actually supervising how those animals are raised, how they're actually slaughtered, how it's processed, even how it's cooked. Now, that gives us many advantages. It allows us to watch television more frequently, it allows us to do things that we perhaps wouldn't have done in the past. It takes a lot of drudgery out of life, but with that brings disadvantages in that because we don't know where that animal came from, we're trusting others to actually tell us whether that's welfare friendly. Because we don't know how it was cooked, we're actually trusting others to make sure it's pathogen free. When we look around a developed country situation like the UK, we don't see animals anymore, and that's because they're inside. They are being fed in houses, they're being looked after out of sight, they're being slaughtered in places that we don't see, and they're being processed in factories again that we don't see inside of. The only thing we see is the meat or the fibre that's produced from those animals. We don't recognise their importance in our lives. But most people are wearing leather shoes, leather belts, they're wearing something with wool in the fabrics that we put on our bodies. They're still very important in terms of how we manage. Even the vegans who don't do those types of things are competing for the same food sources as the animals that we keep. So what's going to happen in the future? Well, if you look at the predictions that people are making, we assume that we will continue to increase the amount of livestock products that we actually have in the world, which means we've got to increase the livestock populations. I'm not so sure those predictions will come true. And the reasons why I doubt that is because our livestock systems at the moment that are feeding us and providing cheap sources of protein are very dependent on cheap fossil fuels, and they're very dependent on cheap feed grains. We can't guarantee that into the future. If we had another 2 billion people, there's every potential that both fossil fuels and food grains will actually increase in price, and the basis of our intensified livestock systems might actually not be in place. So I think livestock will be a component. I don't think they'll be the same systems that we have at this moment in time. I think livestock are part of a sustainable agricultural system. They tend to act as recycling units in a truly mixed system. What we've drifted towards, certainly in the UK, is the removal of livestock from certain environments. So where the Royal Veterinary College is situated at the moment, you don't see very many farm livestock outside. You see a lot of monoculture type, agricultural type systems. And I think that perhaps in the future we'll see more integration or reintegration of livestock into more sustainable systems where we're cycling crop residues back into animals again, and the manure that's produced by those animals goes back into the soil systems to raise crops again. I still think there's space to revisit that type of structure, and I think that's a structure that's possibly more sustainable. It might not provide the cheap sources of meat we've seen in the past, but we mustn't forget that those cheap sources of meat are based around cheap fossil fuels and cheap food grains. So they cannot be a given into the future. I think the exciting thing at the moment is actually unpicking a little bit how our food systems work, putting that message clearly back to the general public, allowing them to see what's actually happening rather than just taking food for granted in the supermarket system, and translating that in terms of better practice of managing livestock in a welfare friendly situation, keeping those animals healthy, and making sure that our processing systems and our retailing systems are rewarding people for best practice. Now, I think that requires us to understand quite carefully who's governing those systems. That's a combination of private companies, strong government, and individuals making appropriate choices when they actually buy things. So understanding what the implications are about buying cheap meat or cheap food, that's a private responsibility combined with a whole range of companies and governments to actually make sure we make the right choices. I challenge anybody to go into a supermarket in the UK at the moment and find out whether the beef they're eating has actually been raised on grass or not. And the answer is no, it's not on the labelling. I think that's something we should be demanding, because I think it's something that's important with regards how animals are raised. So there are certain things I would say need to be improved. With regards to nutritional quality, we still haven't got that right. We're still reliant on measures that we were using 50 years ago. I still think there are things we could add value to that process. We can even shorten some of the food chains. We can insist that some parts of the food that are actually in supermarkets come from local destinations rather than global destinations, and we can understand a little bit better how that actually takes place. And we can spend some of our free time actually checking whether those things are taking place, taking an interest in our food systems, because that is a fundamental basis of society.